Racism and capitalism are perpetuated by U.S. federal government policies in the status quo, and the policies like the affirmative, which seem to solve the problem but don't actually do anything. If we can win that they are not actually going to change people's daily lives, or that they aren't going to change them that much, then you should vote on the critique, because the critique is the only way to actually solve the root cause of these problems, and instead of just covering up oppression. We are keen to solve the interlocking systems of oppression. Even if we lose the root cause debate, we are winning that capitalism is the way that the federal government and that the elites oppress minorities, because they use poverty as a way to keep minorities down. This means that if we can solve for the way that they oppress minorities, we can solve for the effects of racism, even if we don't solve the root cause. However, they conceded the root cause debate in process. This means that we are winning the root cause debate. They conceded that racism exists because people wanted to make more money, and that's why slavery happened. This means that we are winning, that we solve the root cause of capitalism. So if we win the link, then you should vote negative right now, because they are perpetuating these root cause of their impact. So now on the link debate, our first link, you can cross-apply the Farley evidence from Page. What Farley is saying is that federal government policies are constantly going to continue to oppress minorities, regardless of whether they seem to help. He uses the example of Brown versus Board of Education, and our personal experience shows us that Brown versus Board did not actually do anything, because my middle school, which was a public middle school in a rich neighborhood in Baltimore, Roland Park, was almost entirely white people, whereas if you go to a middle school in a more neighborhood with more black people and more poor people, it is going to have much worse teachers, and it's going to be a much worse school. Even if Brown versus Board passed, it did not actually change the actual segregation in the world. And the second link is the root cause argument. They conceded this in cross-sex. This means that if you focus only on racism, you can never solve it, because you will not allow a unified revolt against the state and against the capitalist system. That's our Alexander 10 evidence. Alexander indicates that racism was created to make it so that poor minorities and poor white people would not work together against the capitalist system. This means that if we can prove that their focus on racism is going to stop them from revolting against the capitalist system, that's a reason why we can never solve the affirmative. Our third link is still on the second link, race oppression is used by capital to ideologically justify economic exploitation. The eradication of racism requires a totalizing critique of capitalism. Young 6. Race oppression intersects with the exploitative logic of advanced capitalism, a regime which deploys race in the interest of surplus accumulation. Race operates at the economic base and therefore produces cultural and ideological effects of superstition. Race encodes the totality of contemporary capitalist social relations, which is why race cuts across a range of seemingly disparate social sites. Only one can mark race differently, and its discriminatory effects in such diverse sites as healthcare, housing, real estate, education, law, job market, and many other social sites. I foreground the rationality of these sites within the exchange of mechanisms of the multinational capitalism. The eradication of race oppression also requires a totalizing political project, the transformation of the existing capitalism system, which produces difference, the racial gender division of labor, and the accompanying ideological narratives that justify the resulting social inequalities. The transformation of race and societal exploitation to one of the democratic multiculturalism ultimately requires the transformation of capitalism. And our third link is that they are still making people join the capitalist system. They say they're giving people access to jobs which seem good on the surface, but those jobs are jobs that exist within the capitalist system. They misunderstand this argument. We aren't saying that it's bad for people to have jobs. We are saying that it's bad for people to be given access to jobs in the capitalist system, because they then become dependent on the capitalist system and are less likely to revolt against it. In capitalism, if someone is doing better in the world, that means someone else is all necessarily doing worse, because there is a finite amount of money. So that means that someone is getting more money, someone else is getting less money. So even if they get some people to jobs, that is just going to make life worse for other people, and there is no way that they can actually solve for poverty as a whole if they don't get rid of the capitalist system. And they say that capitalism is inevitable, but it's not. It is actually fundamentally unsustainable, because warming, energy, water, fish, biodiversity loss, and general overshoot of capital has exceeded its limit for regeneration. Foster 5. The unsustainability of our present course is brought home. Climate change will have a potential implication. The world is within a few years to peak oil. The world economy is confronting the diminishing of supplies. This points to the mounting resource wars. The planet is facing global water shortages. This poses a threat to global agriculture. 2/3 of the world's major fish stocks are fished above capacity. Species extinction rate is the highest in 65 million years. Hotspots are now threatening with rapid annihilation. The world economy exceeded the Earth's regenerative capacity. Ecological collapse is increasingly seen as extending today's world of capitalist system. The present human relation is no longer supportable. Capitalist development represents a dead end, and they say that rejection is not going to work, but our alternative is not just rejecting the affirmative, it's not just rejecting capitalism, and saying that instead we should have a revolution against the state instead of trying to work within the state. Those are Huey P. Newton evidence. He is saying that we need to have an intercommunalist revolution against the state. This is the only way to solve, because we are actually rejecting the system as as a whole, that they are continuing to work within the system of capitalism. The links are reasons why they cannot solve and why we need to reject the system of capitalism as a whole. The alt is not the same as previous alts. They say that we've been talking about capitalism in debate for years and nothing has changed, but that's because we were just saying reject instead of actually having an alternative that revolts against the system. On case. On their framework arguments, our personal experience shows us that the USFG can never solve. I gave the example of how my middle school was in a rich, but mostly white neighborhood, and it was a much better school than a lot of other public middle schools in the city because, for example, my friend Erica was the only non-black person. She's Hispanic. She was the only non-black person at her school, and it was a horrible school in a poor neighborhood. The segregation, spatial segregation, makes it so that school segregation still exists, even though Brown versus Board made it illegal. Changing something in the Constitution or changing a federal policy is not actually going to change things in people's lives as our bullet evidence, and also our Farley evidence. What Farley says, this is actually a sort of complicated argument, but basically what Farley is saying is that the federal government, the way that federal government policies work is that they use what's called a screen memory, so they cover up the trauma of the original accumulation, which is when slavery happened, when people were first taken as slaves and first marked as disposable and as less important than other people. That was a traumatic event. So our collective memory has covered up the trauma of that event to allow people to try to use the federal government to change their daily lives. And he uses the example of Brown versus Boyd and how they didn't actually change anything in people's daily lives. And he uses other examples of how things don't actually change anything. So what he's saying is that policies like the affirmative, which seem to be trying to help people's lives and to make people's lives better, are not actually going to change anything in the long term. They are just a continuation of this long history of people forgetting the oppression of the federal government and forgetting that the federal government is the source of oppression. He talks about how the search for equal rights is the search for trying to meet the founding fathers and the promised land and getting the equal rights that the founding fathers promised to everyone, but that for black people, the founding fathers were not just people who ensured rights, they were slave owners, and that represents how the federal government operates for black people, and saying that the federal government is not the promise of equal rights. The federal government is the slave owners who are always going to keep black people oppressed. This is a completely devastating argument for them because they can never solve if they're trying to work within the system. If they're trying to continue to use the federal government, there is no way that they can solve. This is why this is a net benefit to the counterplan. This is why we cannot just try to change policy. We need to reject the state and reject the system as a whole. Reject the capitalist system that creates this oppression and that creates this racial and capital suppression that only rejecting the system as a whole can solve. Because if we try to work within the system, that's just continuing to try to reach the promise of the founding fathers, but they are ignoring the fact that the founding fathers are slave owners for people of color. They are not actually the promise of equal rights that they claim to be. Okay.
Okay, you say reject the system. I mean, you can ask questions while she's saying. What happens if my claim is rejected or
Right, we would do the alternative instead, which is an intercommunalist revolt against the state. So what QEP consensus to happen is that we need to have a system that, a revolt that connects not just different cities or anything, but actually different communities within.
How do we revolt?
We don't specify exactly what the battle plan would be, but it's basically just saying we need to completely reject the state and establish some sort of new system that would be more equitable.
So you're saying
So you want us to do something and we don't know how we're going to do it?
I mean, we don't have a specific strategy for how the revolution would take place. We're just saying that we need to have some sort of revolution against the state, and that trying to work within the state is actually just going to make things worse because of what Farley talks about with trying to pursue this dream that does not exist.
Okay. So you say that capitalism is about competitiveness?
Capitalism is the way that capitalism operates in the context of this debate round is that it is people trying to always make more money, so then they ignore things like human rights issues and the environment. So what the affirmative is in terms of that is it's just integrating more people into that system.
So basically we shouldn't do our plan because it'll make more people think about doing better.
Okay, well we're saying the link that you're talking about here is that saying that the plan might make life better for some people, but because it does not challenge the capitalist system as a whole, that means that if life gets better for some people, it's going to get worse for other people. So it's always going to be poverty.
So if my plan doesn't pass, there'll just be no more people.
I mean, we aren't advocating the status quo. We are saying that instead of doing the plan, we should have a revolution against the capitalist system and the state.
Oh, okay. So, when is this revolution gonna happen?
I mean, the ballot operates as like an endorsement of the revolution and like saying that it's a good idea. We don't like.
So, just saying this it's a good idea. Is the
I mean, you guys like aren't actually going to change the Civil Rights Act if the judge votes affirmative. We're just talking about like what is a better idea to solve these problems.
So you're just talking about what's you're just talking about.
Okay, I mean,
that's the revolution.
both teams in this round.
Can you please just say yes or no? Are you just talking about it? That's the revolution.
It's not like just talking about it. It's an issue of the education that we bring into the round and the type of education that we get in debate. So if the affirmative is bringing education that says we should try and engage the state when it's a futile
so we don't
that's
bring
not
education into the debate?
You're bringing the wrong sort of education, and the education that cannot lead
How are we the wrong sort of education?
Because of all of our link arguments. So for example, like the argument that Farley's talking about, you are continuing to try to solve by using the state, but Farley, do you want me to?
No, you can finish this one if you like.
Okay, Farley is saying that that is a futile struggle, and so if we continue to try to engage the state, that is never going to solve. So saying that we should is not good education. Okay. We're not going for the counterplan. There's no pro on here. They don't have any theory arguments about conditionality, so the negative gets to test the affirmative from multiple different standpoints and then pick one to go for and the two in R. There's no theoretical objection to this, so we're just not going for that argument. Okay, we all agree in this round that transportation infrastructure is racist and that the policies are racist and that they contribute to racial and class oppression. The issue is the methodology for how are you going to challenge that form of racism. So the question that you have to think about in this round is who has the better methodology to actually solve for the racism and the class oppression in transportation infrastructure policy. The alternative on the CAPK is the best way to solve. We have three reasons for the three links that I isolated and the two NC. They don't have any good responses. The first link is the Farley evidence that I went into more detail on case. What Farley is saying is that we cannot ignore the fact that the federal government is the source of oppression and is the source of racism, because when we do that, that leads to people always trying to find a solution through the federal government policies. That means that they're not going to be able to actually solve. He uses Brown versus Board as an example, and I know from my own personal experience that Brown versus Board did not actually make that big of a difference at least in the city of Baltimore, because schools are still essentially segregated, and these schools with more black people have worse teachers and fewer resources than the more wealthy schools with more white people. This is, they haven't answered this argument. This is from our own personal experience. We know that federal government policies have not made a difference, and Farley gives the explanation for why. He says that that if we see the law and the USFG as the promise of equal rights, that's never going to solve, because it's actually for people of color. It is actually the slave master, not the promise of equal rights. This argument goes conceded. This is the first reason why you should vote negative on the CAPK, because we have to reject this system and we have to reject this civil society that holds up the capitalist structure that allows for all of their impacts. The second link is that they're focusing only on racism. We have to recognize the interconnectedness of racism and capitalism, which is why we need to say that we're rejecting the capitalist system as opposed to just trying to solve for racism, because if we continue to try to solve for racism, we can never, that's just going to separate the minorities in the lower class from white people in the lower class, so that we can never have a unified revolt against the government. This is also conceded. And the third argument is that they are integrating people into the capitalist system. They are making it, even if they do improve one person's life, that is going to make another person's life worse, because the way that capitalism works is that they finite amount of money. So if one person gets more money, that means someone else is losing money. So even if they do give some people access to jobs, that is going to hurt other people. There is always going to be a lower class. There is no way that you can solve for poverty as a whole unless you get rid of the capitalist system. In the first place, they have no explanation of how they're going to get rid of the capitalist system. They say they're taking it a step at a time, but they are not a step in the right direction, because they are continuing to try and use the federal government to solve these problems. The federal government can never solve, because it has a vested interest in upholding the capitalist system and an interest in preventing minorities from actually getting anywhere in life, which is what Farley talks about. And they say that we should start with the federal government, but all of the links are reasons why you cannot start with the federal government, because the federal government is never going to actually change policies in a way that help people of color in a substantial way. Even if it does have something like Brown versus Board, our own experience shows us that just did not actually change anything. And they say that it's like local versus federal, but it's not an issue of local versus federal. It's an issue of whether we engage the government at all. We are saying that we should not engage the government at all on the local or federal level. That we have to reject it entirely and have to revolt against the state. That's our Newton evidence. In case we need to have an intercommunalist revolt against the state, which means that we have people from different communities coming together to revolt against the state. So that would involve people of different class backgrounds, as well as people of different races working together to reject the state. If we are focusing on racism, that is going to divide people of different races, and there's no way that intercommunalist revolt can ever happen. happen if we continue to have solely a racial focus, and we need to reject the state and capitalist system in their entirety. This is what Newton is saying, that we cannot just try and reform the state, because reforms empirically have always failed, and we need to reject it in its entirety. We need to stop ignoring the fact that the oppression of, we need to stop ignoring the oppression of US-50 policies, so that we can actually do something to solve these problems. And they say that it's about people making a living, but it's not an issue of improving one person's life. As I already explained, in the capitalist system, there always has to be someone on the bottom. Even if one person manages to climb over to the top, that just means that someone else is losing money and someone else is doing worse. That means that in the capitalist system, you can never actually solve for oppression. You can never actually solve for poverty, because there is always going to be someone on the bottom. You can vote right now on our Farley Adams, because they continue to pursue the impossible dream of engaging the state. They have no answer to this so far in the debate. Don't let them answer in the 2AR, because I don't have a 3NR to respond to that. So you can you have to reject the affirmative and instead endorse an intercommunalist struggle against civil society and the capitalist state, because if we continue to try and use the federal government to solve these problems, that is just going to perpetuate the screen memory and the idea that the federal government can actually do anything to solve for poverty or racism, when really it is the source of poverty and racism. We cannot try and use the federal government to solve the problem that it creates.